Well, I think we should just get started. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Good to see you all. Glad you're here. This is the Clinical Trials Network Translation and Implementation Special Interest Group, or SIG, CTN, TNI, SIG. And, this is our summer presentation. I think, we thought about taking the whole summer off, but we were able to talk our presenter into presenting. We actually was hoping he could present the last time, but he said, "What about June?" And we said, "Okay, let's do it." And so here we are. We won't be meeting again probably until the fall, so don't be looking for an invite for July and August. We'll take those months off and hopefully reconvene, and then also hear from the work groups. But I'm really excited that Dr. Aaron Lyon has agreed to present. He's I don't know, he's sort of a trailblazer in D&I science. I met Aaron through the Implementation Research Institute in St. Louis. He's a former fellow, IRI fellow. He's currently a professor at University of Washington in the Department of Psychiatry and co-directs the UW Alacrity Center. Does a lot of work around youth mental health, and I think is clearly a D&I leader in that domain. He's director of the Research Institute for Implementation Science and Education, or RISE, and he's one of the founding editors for the journal Implementation Research and Practice, which I think is an awesome addition to the field. And I know it's going to grow and flourish and be a resource for years to come. Really this turn into human-centered design, I don't think is entirely new for him, but it's new for a lot of us. And it seems preposterous that we haven't thought about bringing in human-centered design into D&I work. But Aaron and a few others people are kind of the folks that are doing this. So I think we're really indebted to them for doing this, and hopefully we'll learn a lot about how we can incorporate it into our work. So Dr. Lyon, without further ado, glad you're with us. Please share your knowledge with us.
Great, thanks, Mark. It's good to be here. Kicking off the summer, although for any of you here in Seattle, like I know Joe Glass here in Seattle, we're kind of having one of those January days, right? Where summer doesn't seem quite as close as it did, maybe the week before. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about, I'll share my screen. Does everyone see the sort of thing they would expect to see from a person like me?
Yes.
Time like this.
Looks right.
All right, go good. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about human-centered design and implementation science and sort of overlap and alignment and opportunities there. I'm happy to sort of take questions as we go, although it might be a little tricky to monitor the chat. I'll see if I could do that, but feel free to stop me. We're a relatively small group, so that could be pretty easy to do. I co-direct the UW Alacrity Center along with Sean Munson and Pat Arian. We've actually just received our notice of award for the renewal of that NIMH-funded P50. So we're excited about that in another 5 years of doing all this great work. At the Smart Center, I lead along with Joe Locke and Eric Bruns, and we also bring in a lot of human-centered design methods into our work. The Smart Center, the School Mental Health Assessment Research and Training Center, which is really about implementation, research, and practice in schools. So moving right along, I also want to begin just with an acknowledgement that the UW Alacrity Center and Smart Center acknowledge that we live, learn, and work on the ancestral lands of the Coast Salish people who walked here before us and those who still walk here. And we're grateful to strive to respectfully live and work on the lands with the Coast Salish and Native people who call this home. A little funding acknowledgement. I was already talking about the NIMH P50. There's also some additional relevant funding from NIMH and from the Institute of Education Sciences, sort of the Department of Education's major research funding arm, that have made a lot of this possible. I want to start with my endpoints. The first is that the world is designed and can be better designed. Human-centered design and implementation science are overlapping and complementary, similar objectives, but somewhat different foci, and there are opportunities to better integrate the two. I also want to kick off with just a note that design problems are everywhere. You may have seen this. This is a good sort of quintessential example of problematic design. Something as simple as a door, if you approach it and you need a sign to tell you how to use it, it is likely not a particularly well-designed door. Taking your eyes off the road too long or too often could cause a crash, resulting in injury or death to you or others. Focus your attention on driving, and hopefully you're still alive by the time you're done reading this. Perhaps the most famous, it's a well-known fact that you must spin a USB 3 times before it will fit. Therefore, we can deduce that a USB has 3 states: the up position, down position, and superposition. And it will, of course, remain in the superposition until observed. At least for our old USB protocol, USB-C doesn't necessarily have this problem. So, we're always making improvements. These are just some examples of problematic design, not necessarily in the health and implementation space, but that I think carry some lessons and certainly some sort of emotional reactions that I think we can relate to that also connect to some of our even complex health interventions. The alternative to good design is bad design, not no design at all. Everyone makes design decisions all the time without realizing it. And I really like this quote because it sort of surfaces how integral design is to all that we do, even though we might not always realize it. There's a lot of terms that sort of cluster around the ideas that I'm going to be talking about today. Sometimes I refer to this as my a rose by any other name would smell as sweet slide. These are listed in no particular order, and similar to implementation science, where we have sort of overlapping concepts and terms: implementation science, knowledge translation, knowledge utilization, scaling science, etc. We see the same sort of thing within human-centered design. I tend to use the term human-centered design, and some people will argue about which of these terms is the larger umbrella term. Some might say that it is human-computer interaction, which is actually one of the smallest ones here. But these are all sort of in orbit around the same concepts of iterative, contextually driven development and redesign of any kind of practice or product. So human-centered design is an approach that grounds product development and that process in the information about the people and settings who are ultimately going to use it. This is a generic human-centered design framework from the International Standards Organization, where you identify and plan your human-centered design process. You understand and specify the context of use, specify your users and what their requirements are, then develop iteratively and evaluate your design solutions until you meet those requirements. Right? So relatively straightforward, and I think something that aligns with other things that we do, maybe things like PDSA cycles, but specifies it just in somewhat different ways. So I've already been talking about the overlap between implementation science and human-centered design. They both focus on the adoption of new innovations. They're both really oriented toward iteratively solving real-world problems. And they both have multiple sort of constituents or stakeholders, and ultimately are focused on individual behavior. But they go about it a little bit differently. Implementation science has, at least traditionally, had a very strong emphasis on maintaining innovation fidelity, sometimes at all costs. Whereas human-centered design really starts by changing the innovation to meet local needs. Implementation science has strategies that often seek to directly influence the setting. Maybe it's a leadership intervention, like Greg Ahrens and Mark Earhart's LOCI strategy, and that's changing leadership and through it, implementation climate. Human-centered design evaluates but rarely changes the setting itself, and is usually trying to find something that's going to fit into that setting even more. There are some exceptions to this in human-centered design, like systems engineering and service design, but that's a sort of smaller corner of the design space. Those are similar points that were made in this paper by Chen et al. Back in 2020. Really, implementation science contributing broad multi-level frameworks, and human-centered design contributing specific user-focused methods. There's a useful paper that Alex Dopp spearheaded a number of years back that detailed 30 human-centered design strategies, kind of to make them accessible to implementation efforts. These strategies covered a lot of different system levels, but attended to the innovation level itself more than our standard implementation strategies that we all tend to talk about. When we're talking about human-centered design techniques, sometimes I like to place them along a continuum of information gathering to sort of active design and redesign. These can include things like field observations. So some of these are going to be pretty familiar to people who are doing implementation work, right? Observing the settings in which an innovation is going to be used to gather information about the everyday activities and environments, et cetera, of users in that setting. User interviews, individual level interviews, usually designed to gather information about the preferences and experiences, priorities of possible users. Co-creation sessions, a little more active, convening users to have them design an innovation prototype along with you. Live prototyping, provide a functional prototype of an innovation to provide users and collect feedback from potential users as they try to use the prototype for its intended purpose, iterative development, and plenty of others. This is hardly comprehensive, but just to sort of show a little bit of the spectrum of things that people are doing when they say that they're sort of engaging in human-centered design. So how integrated are human-centered design and implementation science? There's a study that Alex Dopp conducted that was an online concept mapping study with human-centered design and implementation experts, and found a sort of final set of 10 clusters. It was with a number of human-centered design strategies, the ones from that paper I was talking about earlier, and a subset of sort of a representative subset of implementation strategies from the ERIC project. And the answer is not particularly. We have 5 implementation-only clusters up top and 2 human-centered design-only clusters on the bottom right. And then we have 3 transdisciplinary clusters: promote leadership and collaboration, understand systems and context, and co-design solutions. And depending on your perspective, this might mean that the 2 fields are nicely complementary or insufficiently integrated. And I won't comment on which I think, because I think maybe it's a little of both. So when we're talking, or at least when I'm talking about human-centered design and targets in implementation, what is the thing that you're going to be designing or redesigning? I'm often talking about evidence-based psychosocial interventions, at least in the mental health space where I work. These sort of complex, sometimes like psychotherapies or parent training protocols, or these things can be better designed and therefore kind of be made more implementable, more sort of streamlined, with lower kind of cognitive load on potential users, either the service providers or service recipients. Digital technologies, which I think most people think of when they hear the words design or human-centered design, as well as our implementation strategies, which themselves are complex psychosocial interventions and can be better designed, especially as we feel that kind of pull in our implementation strategies in order to make sure we get our effects toward larger effect sizes and sometimes more complex interventions. There have been some systematic reviews in health and in education that have demonstrated that non-digital applications are rare. Most of the time, people are applying these kinds of methods. They are applying them to digital tools, and that's totally fine. But that's, in a lot of ways, I feel like, especially in implementation in health and other sectors, just the tip of the iceberg for what can be done. I want to talk for a moment about over-design and under-design, because I think these are some of the design problems, or categories of them at least, that manifest in a lot of our interventions and implementation strategies. We have over-design, where a lot of interventions and strategies are over-designed in order to make sure they perform in research. They may be complicated and infeasible. They often require replacement of existing practices. They might also be under-designed, inflexible, inadequately responsive to novel contexts. And this is an issue because problematic design limits scalability. Obviously, we have major implementation gaps that we continue to try to solve. I don't think I need to define implementation science probably for any of you, but I would argue that both evidence-based intervention and implementation strategy design is an underappreciated determinant of adoption and use. And I think some of this is captured in this quote from Greg Ahrens, that for all types of scaling out, it may be possible to use the identical evidence-based intervention. However, we more often need to adapt the intervention to fit the new population and/or delivery system. This is in Greg's paper about scaling out, sort of deliberate attempts to broaden the delivery of an evidence-based intervention, sort of an extension of scaling out, of scaling up to new populations. And what this really makes me think of is our science of adaptation. This is the original CFIR 1.0 figure. I think they dropped this actual sort of component of the CFIR figure when they released 2.0. But what I always liked about this part of the CFIR was that it showed that there is no implementation without adaptation. Through this process, we're hoping that it's focused on the adaptable periphery versus core components, not that we always know what those are, but that adaptation happens. Adaptation almost has to happen to one extent or another when implementing. So I've always appreciated that about the original CFIR figure. And adaptation is also critical for access. We know that there's low availability of evidence-based interventions many places, but particularly in the community settings where historically underserved, marginalized, minoritized communities are most likely to access care. And when we're thinking about promoting access and adaptation, it's important to keep in mind that adaptations can be proactive or reactive, and sometimes can be a combination of both. But what we're trying to do through our application of human-centered design is to focus most on those sort of proactive adaptations in order to hopefully limit the amount of reactive sort of in the moment adaptation, some of which is going to happen, but which might be associated with more fidelity and consistent kinds of adaptations and perhaps less favorable outcomes. To address all this in the UW Alacrity Center, we've developed what we call the DDBT framework, Discover, Design, Build, Test. This is really just a more specific articulation of that general human-centered design framework, that sort of generic one that I was showing earlier. This is not an implementation framework. As we know, we have many implementation frameworks to choose from. This is an intervention redesign framework that has been and is still being applied across 15 UW Alacrity studies to redesign both client-facing interventions and implementation strategies, some of which have a digital component and some of which don't. The Discover phase really evaluates three things, or at least information in three different categories. Information about the setting, the people, and the thing that's going to be implemented or going to be used by those people. Then we go into this iterative design build phase where we're prototyping design solutions to usability problems that come out of the Discover phase. And then we move into the test phase, which is really a pilot hybrid effectiveness implementation trial to be able to look at things like how well something is actually able to be used and to gather some information about effects to make sure that a redesign process hasn't inadvertently sort of broken an otherwise effective intervention. Throughout all this, we're really focused on the concept of usability, the extent to which a product can be used by specified users to achieve specified goals in a specified context of use. And this is something that we've really had as one of our primary outcomes of our DDBT process, and something that we think of as a key innovation level determinant of implementation. And also a determinant that I would argue, and this is a theoretical relationship, the importance of which increases with scale. In the early years of computers, early adopters like Bill Gates and his contemporaries, they had the motivation and expertise to work around the design problems, which were rampant in early computing, way before we had our point and click kind of interfaces or anything like that. It took some doing to be able to actually engage and learn how to use these new innovative machines. As we've moved outward, though, we've developed interfaces and types of computers that have become much more accessible to all. As we move from those highly motivated and highly skilled and non-representative early users. And the same is true for a lot of our, say, evidence-based psychosocial interventions that may have been developed in research labs or academic medical centers, typically beginning with expert users like incredibly skilled, non-representative, and very motivated graduate students. But as we move outside of those individuals, usability gets all the more important. I'm often asked how usability overlaps with some of our perceptual implementation outcomes, right? Acceptability, feasibility, appropriateness. This is a sort of theoretical relationship between them that I think needs some empirical testing to be sure. I think about usability as a little more context independent and a characteristic of the innovation, but obviously usability and its importance only emerges when it interacts with individuals in context. So the extent to which these things are truly separate is something that's part of our ongoing investigation. I might skip over this. This is just sort of making the point again that usability is a key implementation determinant, sort of flowing to both perceptual and behavioral implementation outcomes, and then ultimately getting to what we're after, which are service outcomes and our sort of client service recipient improvement. When talking about usability testing, I like to lay out some best practices for kind of how to go about doing this, because sometimes the sort of notion of usability testing can be a little bit amorphous. First is the importance of identifying end users, primary users, who are the people whose needs you're really setting out in order to improve the experience of. Secondary users, those who whose needs you could satisfy as long as you don't get in the way of meeting the needs of your primary users. And negative users or non-users, those who you are explicitly not designing for. Because if you're designing for everyone, you're designing for no one. In some of our intervention redesigns, say of cognitive behavioral therapies of one sort or another, our primary users or co-primary users are often our service providers, sometimes our therapists, and our service recipients or our clients. Whereas secondary users might be people like organizational administrators who have a hand in the implementation in that they're key decision makers, but aren't necessarily going to be getting their hands dirty and be some of our primary users. We prioritize components for testing, and I have an example a little bit for kind of that talks about some different pieces of this and ways that we've done that, sometimes through like a task analysis. Always test authentic versus ideal circumstances, often through creating scenarios that reflect some problems that people often run into when trying to use a particular product. Create opportunities for users to interact with components. And I think this is particularly important because ideally usability testing involves some observation, not just people telling you what they're doing, but being able to see what they do. That's why I have this note down at the bottom that focus groups are not usability testing. Focus groups are great and provide fantastic information about context and people and their attitudes and their experiences, but they're not usability testing. Usability testing is best conducted when someone can get their hands dirty with something, even in a somewhat contrived environment, and track success and failure and qualitatively describe issues that users encounter. And I'm going to talk about how to do that in just a moment. I can't see or hear any of you, but I still want you to say this with me. The user is not like me. I want to see you say it. I can only see Mark, so I haven't seen his lips move. So I want to hear it again. The user is not like me.
The user is not like
me.
Okay, thank you.
Like me.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And this is important because it's really easy to lose sight of who we're designing for. Identification of end users is a key sort of aspect of precondition articulation. I'm saying preconditions as the things that might need to be in place to know sort of who would actually be using an intervention or an implementation strategy. But product developers of all sorts tend to underestimate user diversity in their design processes. And what do they do as a result? They base designs on people similar to themselves, which is understandable and a common sort of bias that people can fall into. Fortunately, the identification of representative users and their user needs can help to correct this bias. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about what user identification can look like. This is from a broader sort of methodology that we've articulated for evaluating the usability of evidence-based psychosocial interventions. We start by generating sort of an overly inclusive list of possible users and considering people across different roles. Then we get down into articulating what the most relevant user characteristics are. These could be personal characteristics. Maybe it's someone's age, maybe they're geographic, maybe it's where they are, maybe it's where they work, maybe it's particular experiences they've had. Do they need to have already received training in a particular thing? Do they need to be providers, let's say, in a mental health intervention who are oriented in most of their caseload to anxiety treatment? Maybe those are just some possible examples. Then describe and prioritize main user groups. These are sort of when you're getting into saying who are your primary users, your secondary users, and again, most easily forgotten, but potentially most important, your non-users, those you're not going to be designing for. It's so easy to sort of fall into this trap of assuming that you're designing for everyone because you want it to be potentially usable for everyone, but that can be a very difficult thing to actually achieve. And select typical and representative users for testing. I won't walk through all of these, but these are some examples, sort of an increasing order of cost about what usability evaluation can look like, ranging from quantitative instruments to heuristic evaluation by experts, cognitive walkthroughs, lab-based sort of hands-on usability testing or testing out in the real world, like in vivo usability testing, which almost looks like a little pilot study, except your goal is really to evaluate the thing that's being implemented and where things might be going wrong with it. I often think about something during in vivo testing, like the evaluation of fidelity, not to evaluate the competence with which a provider can deliver something, but where the intervention is failing the provider and not allowing them to achieve their goals. A lot of what we're doing with usability testing is identifying usability issues. These are aspects of the innovation or demand on the user that make it unpleasant, inefficient, onerous, or impossible to achieve their goals. At the UW Alacrity Center, we have sort of these components of a usability issue that we've laid out. First, sort of a descriptive problem statement. What's the issue? From your problem statement, the reader should be able to understand when the problem occurs, for which components of the intervention the problem occurs, for which users the problem occurs, perhaps, what the problem is, and what its consequences are. Then we have sort of a rating for how bad the consequences are, how often does it happen, how complex is it? Is it clear what's causing this, and therefore clear how we can fix it? And then evidence. What evidence from your usability testing supports what you've laid out above? So across all of the studies that we support in the UW Alacrity Center, we've gathered these usability issues, and we actually got 72 discrete intervention and implementation strategy usability issues so far across our different studies. And here they are color-coded by which project actually produce them. Here's one example from a project led by Karen Bears and Jill Locke. And this was from a project that was redesigning a parent intervention for children with autism for teachers. And making something which was called Ruby and turned into Rubies with S at the end is in schools. There was a usability issue that they identified through some in-class observations and interviews where they found that individualized visual supports, which are a core component of the intervention, required a lot of time to develop. They called this a level 2 because it created significant delay and frustration. 7 out of their 8 participating teachers experienced this issue. It was low complexity because it could be addressed via a template for individualized visual supports. So just one example from sort of the whole sort of array of usability issues that we've collected. Based on that array, we've identified 12 usability issue categories. I won't walk through all of these. They're available in a paper first authored by Sean Munson, my co-director at the Alacrity Center. But it could be that it's too cognitively complex or overwhelming. It could be that the intervention itself doesn't build buy-in and show its value sufficiently. Maybe it requires unavailable infrastructure. So that could be something like there's an assumption made within the intervention that something is going to be there, that it requires some physical, systemic, or organizational infrastructure that isn't available. One example from some of the work that we've done in schools is that sometimes there are interventions that assume that there's a multi-tiered system of support already in place in the school. Multi-tiered systems of support is essentially an education-focused version of the old kind of public health model, right, of primary prevention, secondary, right, tertiary prevention, if the intervention assumes that some of the structure is in place, but it's not, that's on the intervention. Sure, the system can continue to develop and can sort of build up this infrastructure, but if the intervention wants to be able to have widespread use, it can't necessarily rely on that assumption. Based on all these usability issue categories, we've created some design heuristics where we've sort of turned each category into a proposed heuristic. These are really design principles that are intended to guide the development or redesign of new interventions and can also be used to evaluate particular interventions. If you think back to that slide I put up where I sort of walked through a few different usability evaluation methods, heuristic evaluation is one type that you can do. Often it's best completed by people who have expertise both in design and the sort of content domain of the thing that they're evaluating. But when you can bring that lens in, it can actually be a fairly efficient way of developing, of identifying usability issues. So these heuristics are things like low cognitive load, efficiently uses time, responsive to existing practices, responsive to existing system constraints, flexible and adaptable, demonstrates value, satisfaction and trust, avoid technology choices that exclude. This is when sometimes we have found usability issues where there's almost an overuse of technology or a sort of defaulting to digital technologies, which can be fine, and we do plenty of work in the digital space, but uncritically examined, going into a digital space can also inadvertently exclude some users or be counterproductive. And it doesn't necessarily solve all of the implementation problems that we're often thinking that it will. Minimal infrastructure, learnable for recipients, learnable for interventionists, and enhances communication and feedback. Now, I'd like to see a show of hands, digital or visual or whatever, if you've ever worried that your intervention or implementation strategy wasn't readily scalable beyond your immediate team. Anyone ever worried about that? I can see Mark has. Anyone? I see some other hands. A practitioner, organizational administrator, research collaborator has ever suggested your intervention or implementation strategy was too cumbersome? Still seeing hands, maybe for the last one, maybe for this one, I'll keep going. Or if you want to make sure that your intervention or implementation strategy is applicable and accessible across a range of different user groups. Seeing a lot of hands there. I mean, so this is really what we're trying to help achieve when we're talking about some of the methods that we've developed for usability evaluation. I mentioned this one very briefly. I'm just going to walk through it really quick. You can, it's one of the articles, actually in one of the first issues of Implementation Research and Practice that Mark was talking about. And this, we start with step one, which kind of goes through what I was already talking about surrounding this like narrowing and funneling of who your potential users are until you come up with your well-specified groups for user testing. Moving into defining your intervention components. So this is meant for sort of client-facing, evidence-based psychosocial interventions, but could be applied to implementation strategies. We have another method that's even more sort of fully specified for implementation strategies. But where you take known usability issues as well as information about core components, and identify really 4 categories of components that all could potentially be the subject of evaluation. The content elements, those content elements are things like maybe it's psychoeducation, maybe it's cognitive restructuring, maybe it's exposure. These are all sort of mental health interventions. The structures, or sort of the things that organize the delivery of those content elements, maybe use measurement-based care. Maybe there's essentially a schematic laying out what you're doing from one point to the next within this intervention, just as a couple of examples. Artifacts, which are what people often think about when they're like, oh, I'm going to do some usability evaluation of this intervention. And they pull out a piece of paper or a digital visualization of something or a manual. And that's good because those are things that reflect certain psychosocial and interpersonal processes that sort of characterize a lot of the interventions that we at least do within mental health, but they only represent them. So you can test an artifact, and sometimes when you test an artifact, you're testing the underlying process, and sometimes you're testing an artifact simply to see how easily navigated it is. That's fine too. And then these parameters, which are these sort of sometimes unarticulated and sometimes obvious components of how something is delivered. Is it group or individual? What's the setting? What language is it delivered in, right? These different things. So once you've sort of identified all these, you can prioritize them for usability evaluation and think, okay, what are the ones that are most likely to have particular issues and which would be most represented? That's what you're doing in step 3, planning and conducting your tests using some of those methods that I was talking about before. And really trying to yield through this, things like overall usability, adherence to design principles, specific usability issues that I was talking about, and then organizing and prioritizing those issues, taking those outputs and putting them into a framework. Here I talk about the user action framework, which is just one way of sort of thinking about different categories that usability issues might be arranged within, and then applying severity ratings in order to prioritize them. I won't walk through this in the same level of detail. This is a sort of a more specified method, whereas the other method talks about cognitive walkthroughs as one example of what you might do. This is just all about cognitive walkthroughs for implementation strategies, where there are some similar steps, but also some steps that are a little more specified because it's just one particular usability evaluation method. But in the interest of time, I think I will jump past that. And I want to just sort of end with a few, as I see them, persistent human-centered design and maybe implementation science in one way or another tensions that I've observed. I'm sure these aren't the only ones, but things that I have seen. The first is this sort of notion of universality versus context dependence of design solutions, right? How attainable is universal design, the sort of notion that some design features or decisions can be applicable across all groups of people? We don't necessarily know. You know, I made the statement earlier, if you're designing for everyone, you're designing for no one. But somewhere on the spectrum is sort of the truth, and the truth might be different for one innovation or another. Is more engagement with a product always better? Especially with digital design, we're often talking about engagement as how long you spend in it and how frequently you come back, how long you use it before you de-adopt, which usually isn't very long for most digital technologies. But that's often focused then on quantity of engagement. But a lot of the work that we're trying to do is also focused on the quality of engagement and how well and how deeply, how fully people are engaging with anything, whether digital or otherwise, in order to meet their needs and what they're getting out of it. How much influence do users have in ultimate design decisions? There really needs to be this balance. Some people sort of wonder, oh, is human-centered design just community-based participatory research? It is not. Human-centered design does not have that sort of tradition of equal, true power sharing. And I think that's an important point to make. Human-centered design is about building empathy and understanding of particular users, but ultimately it winds up sort of reinforcing and making use of some somewhat traditional power structures. These still exist within human-centered design, despite its orientation toward all sorts of individuals and communities and trying to meet their needs. And then one thing that perhaps unsurprisingly, I've been asked more recently over the last few years, can human-centered design help improve health equity? I mean, and I think the answer is maybe. We know that inequities in healthcare often occur as a result of inadequate understanding and incorporation of user needs, right? The core principle of human-centered design is that, constituents and stakeholders and community members are in the best position to communicate their needs to design teams. Early contextual inquiry can help avoid equity-related pitfalls by surfacing information about the destination setting or needs, and can serve as a foundation for redesign. And human-centered design can support equity goals by improving contextual appropriateness and cultural responsiveness of interventions. So, maybe there's some potential there, but not without some really critical re-examination. I love this quote from this paper by Stiles Shields et al. Despite human-centered design's framing as a collaborative approach with end users, power structures are insidious to its practice history. Indeed, the potential for the development of the following power structure is rampant in human-centered design. A designer, often a cisgender, heterosexual white male, attempting to uncover the needs of a marginalized user and or community to create a product. Marginalized users and communities may often already have strong notions of what might work for them and do not need these ideas to be uncovered for them. We cannot promote this group of human-centered design approaches as a means to promote equity in interventions without explicitly acknowledging that it has historically not been used in this way and will not be used for equity without purposeful and continued scrutiny of its practice. So I just want to leave you with that sort of cautionary warning, that very well stated, I think, reality. As a heterosexual, cisgender, white male, I can I represent a lot of what they're saying there. And I just want to sort of own that and recognize that we're not necessarily, as we know in implementation, there are no silver bullets, and human-centered design is certainly not one to achieve health equity without critical examination. But maybe I'll just end with these points that I started with, that the world is designed and can be better designed, that HCD and implementation science have overlapping objectives, but some different foci, and there are opportunities to better integrate the two. So thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. This was really awesome. I'm going to try to find the reaction for clapping, but there it is. The downside of not meeting in person, you don't hear the applause. I'll open it up to other folks that are with us for questions or comments.
I guess I can go first. So I love the talk, thank you. And I think I've heard versions of this before, but one thing I always puzzles me with the design thinking and approaches, how much does this apply to basically service aspects and the more behavioral? I mean, there's the tools that are used, like the visual examples, or these like little components that are actually designed versus the more interactive components that more behavioral. Is it applicable there, or is that more like a domain of coaching and consulting, and the two worlds don't really meet? Is it really ultimately for products or not?
I mean, I think so. When you talk about these sort of different kinds of services, it could be a health service that someone experiences if they're coming somewhere in order to, get care, or even a sort of higher order service like an implementation strategy or something like that, where someone might be trying to influence a particular setting or something like that, or those sort of two types of things that you're kind of putting in that bucket and wondering about. Right.
Like, I mean, say facilitation, right? I mean, how do you use user-centered facilitation in the more interactive component, except for the particular tools that you may use during facilitation that are more object or either virtual or physical or somewhere in between, but is not the actual interaction with, between two humans.
I think anytime you have a task, and that task for something like facilitation or a lot of our implementation strategies are usually sort of social and interpersonal in nature, right? And when you have a task, you can create in a sort of a usability evaluation experience around that task. Sometimes it looks like something that could be like a behavioral rehearsal or a role play, but you can build a usability evaluation protocol surrounding things like that. And you can see where people wind up getting stuck. Anything that you can boil down to some type of task that might be successful or unsuccessful, and you can build a scenario around it that feels representative and sort of true to the people who have been using it, you can do usability testing surrounding. It's somewhat more complicated, right, than showing someone an app and seeing, you know, whether they can find the next button or something like that, but it can be done.
All right, thank you.
Hey, Aaron, I'll ask a question. I was wondering, what is your preferred way to staff user-centered design studies or human-centered design studies? I'm sure there's a range of options. You know, do you like to involve people with, you know, master's degrees and some kind of design, you know, who may have gotten, you know, training in, you know, art or just the process of user-centered design? Do you like to involve PhD researchers from, you know, information schools? What do you think is kind of the menu of options for different studies?
That's such a good question, Joe. And we've done it so many different ways. You know, sometimes we've had our kind of standard research staff who, you know, have just kind of built their fluency through doing some of this work and working on some of these projects. There have also been times like at the UW Alacrity Center, you know, we had a sort of user experience researcher on staff for a while who had done a lot of this and had done a good amount of work in service design in particular. And that was certainly very helpful. We also have some graduate students and undergraduate students through the Department of Human-Centered Design and Engineering. And so I think it's been broad. We've had a broad array of people. I mean, these are things that people can learn and can pick up. And sometimes it's a matter of who are you counting on to actually design the study versus carry it out, and where are people sort of in their own development in their careers. So it can look a lot of different ways, but I mean, obviously having people who are more experienced, especially experienced perhaps outside of just the digital space, has been, I think, pretty useful for us. The more experienced people are, the less sort of hands-on, you know, development of your usability testing protocol and things like that you might need to do as an investigator.
Thanks for the presentation. You mentioned that these are skills that can be learned as an early career investigator. Like, what do you sort of recommend as ways to learn about some of these techniques and strategies?
Yeah, there's a number of like online resources and courses and things like that. Like the one that always comes most readily to mind are the offerings from IDEO, which is sort of a design firm in the Bay Area that was one of the early players in human-centered design. I mean, there's also university-based opportunities sometimes. One of the things that I did that really got me into this space was as a component of a K award, I completed a certificate program, like a year-long certificate program through the Department of Human-Centered Design and Engineering here at the University of Washington. And I don't think I realized at the time actually just what a strength the University of Washington has in this domain, which it turns out is very significant, and I feel like I was at the right place at the right time. But there are examples elsewhere, and I think increasingly different programs, some of them free, some of them not, out there online to be able to access some of this stuff, even if your local institution doesn't necessarily have like a certificate program like that.
Hi, I'm wondering if you have any recommendations for on how to apply the human-centered design principle to design things like a dashboard for an implementation trial. I'm asking because in one of our study, we're using, audit and feedback as an implementation strategies. And we really want to reiterate or continue to reiterate on the design of the dashboard itself to make it user-friendly for our participants.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a few different things you could do. If you wanted to do it just sort of based on principles, you could do sort of a heuristic analysis, and just those principles are not the only sort of design principles out there. And I think that there might be ones that are even sort of more specific to dashboard design that could exist. I know some people have done work explicitly on kind of information dashboard design. One thing I might also encourage you to do is, as you're sort of thinking about the design of your dashboard, make sure, and you may have already sort of done enough of this, but make sure you're also thinking about the design of the entire audit and feedback strategy and process, and how these things relate to one another, right? Because we don't need to unnecessarily pigeonhole ourselves into thinking about just the application to the digital piece of our implementation strategy. But I think some of it is thinking, okay, what are the specific things you want people to be able to do? What do you want them to be able to do with your dashboard? Can you articulate some kind of user testing research questions, which might be different from your overarching research questions, in order to sort of drive task identification, maybe construction of some scenarios, and then putting it in front of people and seeing how well they're able to achieve those goals.
Very helpful. Thank you.
Other questions? This is totally interesting.
I'll go with another one that kind of echoes maybe some concerns we've seen in the implementation science field. So along the idea, and I really thought it was a brilliant piece, identifying the users and engaging them. But then we know, even if we can identify them categorically, there's a distribution. Like if you go with the diffusion of innovation, you have the more early adopters and the laggards, and we all often struggle with the laggards because they end up being non-adopters, or we can't get to them. How do we gauge them earlier in the process to uncover whether they have different perspectives or some different input that we need to incorporate? Any tips on that?
To engage them in sort of the user-centered process.
Exactly, because
right? Because of course they're the most, yeah.
Right, you hear from the ones that are readily available, want to participate and engage, and they may have fewer, kind of those resource constraints, perhaps, or even perceptions, or they are unrepresentative, even though we try to be inclusive, but then we still sample just particular individuals that may not be fully representative. And it's like, well, you've addressed some of the concerns.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, exactly. Because those might be the most important people to get into your usability evaluation, in order to make sure that you're designing for people who aren't just going to be fine with whatever, and aren't going to be those kind of early adopters or keeners, right, who are just going to jump into it. I mean, I think a lot of it relates to how you might do it from an implementation perspective, making it easy for people, coming to sort of going to where people are. Making it worth their while, if they're going to give you their time. Sometimes I think people who might be less likely to implement something might still be likely to come and tell you everything that's wrong with the thing that you would like them to implement, which in a way I think can also be an engagement hook. One thing that I've never tested and that I always want to is evaluating whether some of these human-centered design methods, whether the sort of influence of it is all contained within the thing that comes out the other end, or how much of it is the engagement process of someone having sort of buy-in and investment in the thing, right? Because so I do think that this isn't exactly your question, but I think it is related, that engagement in some of these processes can be a strategy for sort of building goodwill. That might be the best I've got.
Yep, thank you. No, I'm always curious to hear thoughts on this, so thank you.
One of the things that, Aaron, you may or may not know is that that what brings us together in this group is we're all affiliated with the NIDA Clinical Trials Network, which is a network of 13, 14 nodes scattered across the U.S. that's primarily dedicated to developing and evaluating interventions, whether they're psychosocial or pharmacological. And as I think about what you're describing and the kind of the rigor, and thoughtfulness, and it does seem to me that to the degree that one goes about using human-centered design, the likelihood for a scalable intervention goes up. But my sense is that we're only just beginning to think about user-centered design per se in our protocols, in our applications. And I'm looking at this audience, and I know that there are a couple of people who've been developing or even doing projects involving intervention development, and using the usual things where there's qualitative interviews to evaluate acceptability and feasibility and appropriateness. But I do think it would be really nice if our field turned a little bit more, if not dramatically so, in the direction of user-centered design, because the things that you've described, I think, would really be a major methodological contribution. And I'd like to see us take that turn. And I know a few of you, have completed Ks that are off the runway, and others are waiting to hear about other grants. And I know one is, starting a new intervention study. So I think that people are definitely neck deep in this kind of work.
No shortage of good, important work to do, that's for sure.
Well, I am conscious of our time. We're at the top of the hour. Aaron, thank you for your generosity in sharing all of this great stuff with us. I actually had not realized that you've been as productive in terms of publications of this work. I knew about a couple of those things, but I didn't know about the American Psychologist article. That's really awesome that you've dented that major journal. So I know I still get it in the mail. It's a magazine I get. Which is pretty unusual these days. But everyone, thank you. Aaron, thank you specifically, again, for sharing your wisdom with us. And my sense is that people will be circling back to you with specific questions, but really awesome work. And thank you for advancing our field.
Sounds great. Thanks so much for having me.
All right. Bye,
Good day,
everyone. Thank you.